Just came here to do my job. This is what I'm supposed to do. Give me a chance. Give me a chance to be great. I want to be great.
This is what movies is made of.
This is what movies
is made of. 4 months away, I come back, 2 free throws. Don't worry about it. I got that.
Just because the Minnesota Timberwolves just finished having their best season in 20 years doesn't mean that they didn't hit the ground running to make sure that they keep their most important pieces in place. Tim Connolly agreed to a contract extension with the Minnesota Timberwolves, which is without a doubt the most important piece of this operation. He literally turned one of the biggest laughingstocks in the NBA into one of the best teams in the Western Conference and a team that made it to the Western Conference Finals. Everybody was cheering for Anthony Edwards, and maybe if Chris Finch was fully healthy and was able to be on the sideline, then things could have been a little different. And that's why the Minnesota Timberwolves also extended Chris Finch for 4 years. But there's a huge question as to how this team can improve, and ownership might make it very difficult. So we have a lot to discuss. Before we get to the content, we are on the grind to 1 million subscribers. We are less than 70,000 subscribers away, so if you want to help us get to that goal, make sure you sub and turn on our notifications. And now that we get all that out of the way, cue the intro. Mic check 1 2 1 2. What's going on, everybody? The Minnesota Timberwolves reached the Western Conference for the second time in its franchise's history. And this is the very first time they did it since 2004, way back when Kevin Garnett won MVP and was doing things like this. I think people forget how dominant a prime pre-Boston Kevin Garnett truly was. He gave his best years to the city of Minnesota, and it was truly heartbreaking for him to not be able to bring a championship to Minnesota. But that aside, let's discuss the current Minnesota Timberwolves. Having spent much of the season as the top team in the West, the Timberwolves proved that they were no fluke when they beat the reigning champion Denver Nuggets in Game 7 of the Western Conference semifinals in Denver. This team overcame an insurmountable lead by the Denver Nuggets to win Game 7 in Denver, and it truly showed that the Minnesota Timberwolves could overcome anything. The reward was facing off against one of the hottest teams in basketball, the Dallas Mavericks, who had just beat 2 50-win teams in the Los Angeles Clippers and the OKC Thunder. I keep telling y'all, the Western Conference is extremely stacked. Now, we all know what would happen from there. The Mavs would go on to nearly sweep the Minnesota Timberwolves. I don't think the series score is really reflective of how intense of a series it truly was. And now there's a huge question of what the future of the Minnesota Timberwolves is going to look like. Typically, you'd think, Mike, oh my God, the Timberwolves made it all the way to the Western Conference Finals. Surely they're going to run it back with the same roster, right? It's a little bit more complicated than that. Despite their success this season, the T-Wolves actually find themselves at a dangerous crossroads. After all, how did a team that was looking like championship favorites end up getting bounced in such fashion? I mean, seriously, with Anthony Edwards on the offensive end, a 4-time Defensive Player of the Year, Rudy Gobert on the defensive end, 6th Man of the Year, Naz Reid coming off the bench, where do they fall short? And I know what you guys are gonna say,
Mike, Rudy Gobert sucks on offense.
but it's a little bit more complicated than that. Now, could it have been because of this man right here? Opinions may vary. All the way at the very beginning of the season, I warned you guys on this channel that the Minnesota Timberwolves might be looking at trading Karl Anthony Towns. The thing is, back then, Naz Reid didn't emerge as a legitimate replacement. So trading the Timberwolves franchise cornerstone, or one of their franchise cornerstones, seemed a little boneheaded, at least back then. And even now, some people might think it's a little boneheaded. But there's a reason why Karl Anthony Towns finds himself in rumors. And we'll start from the most clear, obvious reason of all. There are times where Cat and Rudy Gobert just don't seem to fit well with each other. But that aside, Karl Anthony Towns completely disappeared in the conference finals. I mean, he went a combined 3 of 22 from beyond the arc during the first 3 games of the conference finals, as well as 0 for 8 from beyond the arc in game 3. His team was down 0-2 on the road and needed to keep their season alive. And look, if Anthony Edwards pulled a disappearing act, which there were games where he disappeared as well, I'll forgive it. Anthony Edwards is relatively young. Even Michael Jordan needed 6 seasons to win his first championship and actually make a dent in the playoffs. I understand a lack of playoff experience affecting your play in the playoffs, especially when you're getting that close to a championship run. But Karl Anthony Towns doesn't really have an excuse. He's been in the NBA for 8 seasons. And although you could say he was devoid of playoff experience himself, he is the leader of this franchise. He is supposed to be the Shaq to Anthony Edwards' Kobe. And the problem is, this isn't just one occasion where Karl Anthony Towns disappeared. When you go further into the numbers and compare Rudy Gobert to Karl Anthony Towns, Gobert not only has the better plus minus in the regular season, but also in the playoffs. Whereas Karl Anthony Towns' plus minus has been plus 360 in their regular seasons together, that number actually goes into the negative at negative 28 in their playoff trips. When you compare that to Rudy Gobert, who's been a plus 404 in these 2 regular seasons, a number that, unlike Karl Anthony Towns, actually stays in the positive at plus 77 in the playoffs, including a top 5 plus minus finish in the 2024 playoffs at plus 95. Now, to all you Rudy Gobert haters out there, tell me which of these 2 big men is really the problem. But to be fair, this isn't completely on Karl Anthony Towns being inconsistent. Well, I mean, it kind of is, but there is actually more to it, because if Minnesota does elect to move on from the stretch 4, a lot of this decision could be so they can avoid going into the luxury tax threshold, like some NBA executives are suggesting may be a possibility. Now, I know I sound like a broken record every single time I bring up the first and second tax apron, but I think it's very important to all the viewers of this YouTube channel to memorize the new CBA, because that's going to be very important when we want to analyze trades in the future and discuss why teams would make specific trades. Kind of like when the OKC Thunder traded Josh Giddey to the Chicago Bulls for Alex Caruso. You wouldn't see a trade like that being made underneath the previous CBA. In this current climate, teams really need to be wary of who they pay. It's a huge reason why the Los Angeles Clippers are also lowballing Paul George. Now, in the past, there was a first tax apron, which means if you exceed $178.7 million, you're not allowed to acquire a player in a sign and trade or use a pre-existing trade exception. You can't take back more money in a trade, which makes it harder to trade players. You're not allowed to sign a player waived during the regular season that had a pre-existing salary of $12.9 million plus, but you are allowed to use a trade exception created from a new trade, and you're allowed to use the $5.2 million taxpayers mid-level exception. Now, if you go to the second apron, it makes things even more intense. Obviously, the first 3 rules apply if you're underneath the second apron, but on top of that, it's even more difficult to trade for players. You're not allowed to aggregate contracts sent out, meaning you can't combine salaries of players to get a player that is making way more, or the contract combined of the 2 players you're trying to send out. You're not allowed to send out cash. You're not allowed to sign a player waived during the regular season that had a pre-existing salary of $12.9 million plus. You're not allowed to sign and trade your own free agent if the incoming salary exceeds the second apron. You're not allowed to use a trade exception created from a sign and trade. You're not allowed to use a trade exception created from a new trade, and probably the most sinister rule of all is your 2032 first round pick is frozen if a team finishes the 2024-25 season over the second apron, and the second apron is $189.5 million. So with that being said, teams have to be very careful about who they decide to pay. And Karl Anthony Towns is currently making $36 million a year, which doesn't completely break the bank yet, but next year that salary is going to rocket to almost $50 million, which means that Minnesota has a decision to make on whether or not they should lower their payroll in order to avoid the luxury tax. Alongside Anthony Edwards' $42 million salary next year for making the All-NBA, and Rudy Gobert's $44 million salary. These 3 players alone will be responsible for about $135 million of a roster that will cost about $200 million, which means if you want to keep these top 3 and keep Jaden McDaniels and Mike Conley, who are both on remarkable contracts. Jaden McDaniels is making $22.6 million this year. Mike Conley's making $10 million this year. The T-Wolves starting 5 would make about $167 million this season, which is still short of the luxury tax line. So you might be wondering, Mike, what's the problem? Well, there is a huge problem. First of all, there's the additional players that are coming off of the bench, which will get you to about $200 million including the pending free agents, which will mean that the franchise will then be a tax-paying team and would not only have them exceed the second apron, but this would force the NBA to make Glenn Taylor pay $75 million. And if you didn't know, Glenn Taylor has barely spent $25 million on luxury tax throughout his entire career, with less than $2 million of that coming since 2005. To even consider this as a possibility is absolutely absurd. Now, taking all this into consideration alongside what we've seen of Cat, it's only right for the Timberwolves to begin scouring the market to see what they could get for him, which begs the question, what could they actually get for him? And even more important than that, what could they get for him that could help them win right now? Because make no mistake about it, this is not a team that wants to make moves to compete again in 2 or 3 years. This is a team that would only make this move because they believe that the future is now, and that the pieces obtained in return would give them a better chance to win a title in 2025 or 2026 at the very latest. When you have a generational talent like Anthony Edwards, the clock starts ticking from the very moment they show signs of playoff dominance. And in case you've been living underneath the rock, Anthony Edwards has been doing that. So if that's the case, who should trade for Cat? Well, one option could be the Atlanta Hawks. The Atlanta Hawks could unload Trae Young and receive Karl Anthony Towns, a 2026 first round pick, and a 2029 first round pick swap. But that wouldn't make a lot of sense because you're essentially swapping out one star that's making a significant amount of money for another player that makes a significant amount of money, although it does allow Naz Reid to start, and Trae Young and Anthony Edwards sound like a remarkable backcourt, even though Trae Young's a defensive liability and wouldn't really fit on the Minnesota Timberwolves that are very defensive minded. So what about DeJounte Murray? The Atlanta Hawks would receive Karl Anthony Towns, and the Minnesota Timberwolves would receive DeJounte Murray and Bogdan Bogdanovic. Bogdanovic could come off of the bench. DeJounte Murray fits into Chris Finch's defensive philosophy. It'd be a seamless fit for the Minnesota Timberwolves, and it would be their dream scenario. But let's say you don't want to do that. What if you just want to get some good role players to bolster the bench and also get some assets for the future? Well, the Brooklyn Nets come to mind. You could trade Karl Anthony Towns to the Brooklyn Nets for Cam Johnson, Dennis Schroeder, Day'Ron Sharpe, a 2027 and 2029 first round pick swap that belongs to the Phoenix Suns. And believe me, by 2027 and 2029, I'm sure the Phoenix Suns are going to have a very valuable draft pick. An interesting option could also be Brandon Ingram, depending on the contract that he gets, and Dyson Daniels going over to the Minnesota Timberwolves in return for Karl Anthony Towns. Brandon Ingram has always been long and boasted tremendous defensive potential. Maybe Chris Finch could unlock that, and he could also share some of the scoring duties, which is something that the Minnesota Timberwolves could desperately use. This team needs some more help on offense without sacrificing too much defense. There are other teams that could potentially trade for Cat, like the New York Knicks could trade Julius Randle for Karl Anthony Towns, and the Knicks have always been rumored to be interested in Cat even as early as last year. But obviously the dream scenario for the Timberwolves in this particular instance would be the Atlanta Hawks and DeJounte Murray. How big of a deal is this luxury tax situation? Well, you have to consider the fact that the Minnesota Timberwolves are currently in the process of being sold. Glenn Taylor has always been a frugal owner. He's been more focused on his team being profitable than his team winning championships. And that's not really a problem. It sucks for fans, but at the end of the day, some owners do opt to run their team like a business, as opposed to losing millions of dollars and watching their team win. Originally, the plan was to sell the team to Alex Rodriguez and Mark Lore, but since they failed to submit their payments in time, it now seems that it may never happen. In the time since all of the drama surrounding the once guaranteed selling collapsed, Glenn Taylor actually came out and spoke about the subject.
Why was it a 3-year process?
It was pretty simple negotiation. I said that I'll name the price and you can name the terms. And I gave them a price and they accepted the price, and the terms were they would pay for it over 3 years. We had a contractual agreement, and the agreement said that they, in the first 2 years, they would come in as limited partners, and how they would present their ability to be limited. This payment would give them controlling interest, and it's a totally different process than being a limited partner. And they had to do certain things to get there, and they didn't.
All these moving parts, the trade market for Towns, the luxury tax concerns, the failed sale of the team, the woes against the Dallas Mavericks, one thing is for certain, it is a wild time to be a Timberwolves fan. After 20 years of pain, they finally assert themselves as an up-and-coming team, and then the past catches up with them. They are a prime example of how poor ownership can keep a team stuck at the bottom, but luckily for them, they have one of the best young players in the entire NBA. They clearly nailed their head coaching hiring of Chris Finch, and the defensive identity that he instilled into the Minnesota Timberwolves worked perfectly. They just need a little bit more help offensively without sacrificing that defense, and most importantly, the architect of this team is under contract for the foreseeable future. The question now seems to be whether or not Anthony Edwards becomes great enough to counter all of the damage done by decades of inept leadership, and if he can lead the Minnesota Timberwolves to their first ever NBA championship, regardless of the off-the-court drama. Whether they go after this goal with or without Karl Anthony Towns is only the first order of business, and we should find out what their decision is within the next 2 weeks. But Karl Anthony Towns isn't the only individual that is on the trade block. There's a huge question of what Paul George's future is going to look like with the Los Angeles Clippers. They are lowballing Paul George, and they're paying Kawhi Leonard more than him despite Paul George playing in more games. He is without a doubt the hottest free agent on the market right now, and the Clippers are playing a gigantic game of chicken with him. So what are they going to do? Well, we have a whole video on that, and I'll leave it in the end screen, as well as a video on Klay Thompson for you guys to check out, because I don't think he's returning to the Warriors. I'll meet you guys there, and aside from that, I'm your boy Mike, and I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.